Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. Today, we are lucky enough to be interviewing Jonathan Carr of Carr's Ciderhouse and Preservation Orchard, located in Hadley, Massachusetts. If you've never been to Carr's, picture in your mind's eye chestnut trees swaying in the breeze with patrons sitting in the shade beneath them, sipping cider as baby goats baa in the background. It's idyllic, and one of the best examples of a truly regenerative farm that I've seen in New England. Regenerative practices in an orchard setting are the focus of today's discussion, but we also cover cider making, climate adaptation strategies, value-added products, unusual tree crops, and a variety of other topics. Stick with us. Let's start off with just, your personal background and professional background and how you came to be doing what you're doing at Carr Ciderhouse in Hadley, Mass.
I guess I could say I've always been a plant nerd, probably because my mom sent me to like Audubon camp and everything like that. But through my undergrad years at Rutgers, I was basically putting together what was agroecology before like such a program existed. So I ended up with a degree in ag sci because they didn't know what to make of me. But then, so that was in the early 90s. And then I headed out to California for the University of California, Santa Cruz Farm and Garden program. And that's just this like wonderful hands-on intensive like 6-month organic ag training program that has like put a lot of people through it over the years and trained a lot of farmers. And it was just a wonderful way to get my hands really dirty for the first time, I would say. I happened to meet my wife out there who was visiting the farm, and we decided to move to Ireland, where I was born, but moved away as a child, and my father still had the family farm there. So we came up with this business plan of starting a market garden, bringing some of the cool like vegetable varieties that we were growing out in California to Ireland to grow them for restaurants and at a farmer's market. So, we were growing like sun-gold tomatoes and salad mix and everything like baby turnips and stuff like, people hadn't really heard of in Ireland. So that was a lot of fun. When we were living there, it was like 4 or 5 years, late 90s, we were exposed to European like hard cider culture, basically. And so got really into trying hard cider in France and England and in Ireland. So eventually we got a little tired of the climate, actually. I mean, it's a beautiful country, but it rains, I'm going to say 250, 300 days a year there. So that was hard. So we decided to go back to more sunshine, and we landed in Hadley, Massachusetts because of like family and friend connections here. It's such a cool area with, it's both rural, but, sophisticated, a lot of stuff going on here. Anyway, I ended up in grad school at UMass studying pomology, came across this opportunity to buy some APR land. And that, in short, is like a protected land in Massachusetts where the state buys the development rights and keeps the land affordable for farmers because there's no development pressure.
Gotcha. I got to say, I really resonate with what you had to say about Hadley and Western Mass being a nice blend of like rural, but also a lot of interesting things to do. For listeners, if you haven't been, best time to visit, I think, is during Franklin County Cider Days, which happens every year in the fall. So, Jonathan, you said that you got a degree in pomology at UMass. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, the pomology degree was, it was really interesting and wonderful professors, but it was kind of a different paradigm than I wanted to approach orcharding from. So I left the program, and in 2006, we got a farm loan to plant up the orchard. And all my research indicated that, we wanted to put in traditional hard cider varieties. So the plan was to make hard cider from the beginning. And our experience in Ireland as market gardeners informed us that we didn't want to just be growing apples. We wanted to make a value-added product so that we could, really gain all the benefits of the extra value that you can sell hard cider for versus, just apples at the farm stand. And then also just that, the art and craft of cider making itself is very intriguing and beautiful. So we planted 1,600 trees in 2006. And so the business didn't really kick off until 2012. So this is Carr's Ciderhouse. And so we started making hard ciders, and we decided to add other traditional New England cider products like cider syrup and cider vinegar and switchel and all of these old fashioned things that they used to make in New England, but nobody was doing that much anymore of. Yeah, we learned some fun facts too about, cider syrup is also called boiled cider. And in the slow food arc of taste, it turns out that the first recorded instance of making cider syrup in the United States was in Hadley, Northampton in 1677. So that was inspiring to find that out.
I'm interested in what the paradigm in the UMass pomology program was that was different from what you were interested in. I'm assuming it was that there was more conventional orcharding, and I don't know. I don't want to presume anything, but could we talk about that for just a second before we move on?
Yeah, no, it was absolutely full on conventional. There was an emphasis on IPM, or integrated pest management, which is a way to spray less, through monitoring pest and disease levels in your orchard, no only spraying when you reach an action threshold, and, ways for growers to not just be dousing their orchard like on a weekly basis, which is kind of more or less the old traditional model. So, IPM is a big improvement over that, but it's still chemical intensive. It's still diesel intensive. At that point, even then I was, climate change was on the radar. I was thinking about, wow, these are really energy intensive approaches. Big tractors, spray rigs, getting out there, burning a lot of fuel, mowing a lot. Conventional systems, require close cropped grass alleys between the tree rows, often herbicide strips under the trees. That I was just thinking, how can we do this a little differently? And there wasn't really a lot of like information within the program about that, because it's really geared towards kind of supporting like the apple industry in Massachusetts. Understandably, that's just the conventional approach, and it works. They make great apples too, but it just wasn't my approach.
Was there any precedence at the time in Western Mass or the greater New England region of people doing things differently?
Well, not that I came across at the time. I started noticing that unmanaged trees still produce lots of apples, and that, obviously when you're growing apples for a consumer, it has to be perfect. There's this standard of perfection, in supermarkets right now, but when you're squeezing them and making hard cider, vinegar, whatever, it doesn't actually matter if the fruit is blemished, or has a little, specks on it from fly speck or sooty blotch, or one of these cosmetic diseases. I realized that it really didn't have to be that way at all in terms of chemicals. Certainly there are pests that are more problematic, like they'll cause the inside of the fruit to be rotten, like apple maggot and codling moth and ones like that. That would be bad for cider quality. So in the course of my studies, I basically found out that late season, what are called like winter storage apples, these really dense fleshed fruit, were almost like bulletproof. Like it's very difficult for pests to work their way into them. Oftentimes the cell pressure and density is so great that it will like crush, larvae of insects. And so maybe they'll be a bit marked up, but they won't be suffering, like softer fruit will, and just kind of be rotten on the inside just from a pest burrowing in there. And, I learned some pretty interesting stuff from, there was a professor there called Ron Prokopi, and he was like the IPM guru back then. He passed away in the early 2000s, but, he said something to me that really stuck with me, which was that the absolute most pest and disease resistant apple he had ever encountered, which included a lot of, modern fruits bred for disease resistance. His observation was it was the Baldwin apple, which was the predominant apple grown in New England until the 1930s, when Macintosh took over. I thought, whoa, that's pretty amazing actually, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because the Baldwin apple was selected in a time when they didn't have modern sprays or techniques or anything like that, so it had to be a really tough, productive apple. So those were the things I absorbed from the program.
Yeah, the heirloom apples of New England, the culture behind their selection and what apple orcharding or orchard culture was like back then is really, really intriguing to me. How much did that history inform the mission of Carr's Ciderhouse and Preservation Orchard? Or was there a different influence that led you to adopt regenerative orchard practices?
I have a natural aversion to spraying. I don't know. I grew up in a household that maybe had some Mary Baker Eddy influence or something like that. And so chemicals were really, we looked at askance. So, when I saw that we could indeed grow apples without spraying, not without another subset of problems. I mean, your yields aren't as good, and your fruit is blemished, and you have to sort it carefully before pressing and everything like that. But that's a trade-off I was willing to make. But I think what really got the wheels turning was the question of like, what else can we grow without spraying? And this was really catalyzed in 2018 because we had our first really big fire blight outbreak in our orchard. And we planted a lot of English traditional hard cider apples. So these are apples like Dabinet, Kingston Black, and what we thought was Yarlington Mill, but turned out to be an apple called White Jersey because it was misgrafted. So fire blight wasn't observed in Europe until the 1950s. So the traditional cider apples in England really had no exposure to fire blight. And it turns out a lot of them are highly susceptible, unfortunately. Half our Dabinet block, something like 700 trees was wiped out by fire blight in 2018. I would say this is due to climate change. We're having warmer, more humid weather earlier in the season, which is like ideal conditions for the fire blight bacterium. So we needed to think about how we were going to proceed from there. And so I think that was like the genesis of Preservation Orchard and Farm at that point, because we realized we needed to diversify and to, look at alternative tree crops that didn't need to be sprayed, where, were tough, were delicious, that, made amazing food and food products. And so I think that turned out to be a wise decision because we got really hammered by fire blight in 22 and 23, and our English apples are basically down to 25% of planting density. So we're going to remove them all at this point, and we're just going to plant southern apples and wild apple selections from the US that are known to be fire blight resistant or immune.
I'm really sorry to hear that about the fire blight incidents. Could we do a little bit of explanation for folks? What is Preservation Orchard? What is Carr Ciderhouse? Are they the same thing? Are they two things combined?
Yeah, sure. Well, Carr Ciderhouse is the business we started in 2012 that was just focused on cider products from our orchard. And then in 2018, we started working with Rachel Haas and Matt Kaminsky, who have meadow-fed lamb, and Matt Kaminsky is gnarly pippins. He's our wild apple forager for our cider blends, and great friends of ours. So they started grazing sheep on our orchard. And so that's when we initiated silvopasture to reduce mowing. And then we were collaborating also with Rob from Pioneer Valley Apiaries, who had his bee yard on our orchard. Also, my daughter, Ava, and her partner, Joe Manning, decided to start a market garden business on some flat ground at the bottom of the hill. So it sort of was evolving into this collaborative, like a number of different farm businesses. So that's really what Preservation Orchard is. And that even includes a staple food growing co-op that we run with some local friends, where we have a little patch of ground and we just grow things for keeping over the winter, or preserving, canning. So it's kind of like a matryoshka doll, a lot of little nesting sub operations going on in Preservation Orchard.
I think that the collaborative use of land is fantastic, and really promotes kind of the ideals that we want to see in these sort of landscapes. So why did you choose the name Preservation Orchard?
I guess I would just say like the name, preservation is just both like a nod to the past and the future, in that, there's been a lot of farming knowledge lost from, traditional systems that were like low energy input, and that we are very interested in kind of knowing how those worked, but also, a bridge to the future where we want to be able, I feel like the writing on the wall is that we're going to have a lower energy input future at some point. I know peak oil keeps on kicking down the road with new extraction technologies, but it's going to happen sooner or later. And then we have all the problems that are going to, come up because of climate change. And it's just, so drastically different even now than it was 10 years ago. So how are we going to, what are we going to grow? How are we going to adapt to that? How are we going to kind of preserve a path forward to be growing things in this area that are appropriate?
So if we could kind of lean into that a little bit. You mentioned that you're planning on shifting from the English varieties to Southern apple varieties. my understanding of the reasoning why there is that, our growing season has extended by, I think, almost like 10 days at this point. But don't those southern varieties, and maybe they're more fire blight resistant, but don't they have their own set of pests in the south that will probably also be moving north as the climate shifts? I don't know too much about this, and yeah, I'd like to know more.
It's possible. It's just that, basically the South is a weather preview of, what it's going to be like here sooner or later. And so these traditional varieties that were selected under longer growing seasons, higher humidity, more pest and disease pressure, they've evolved certain characteristics that help them tough it out. So, I mean, examples of those include the Virginia crab, also known as the Hughes crab, which has been cultivated for hundreds of years. It's sort of like a rangy tree with a very open structure. So maybe that allows for better conditions that will reduce humidity in the canopy and will help the tree stay healthier. There's the limber twig apple. Well, actually, it's kind of a family of apples. One that we're interested in is the old-fashioned limber twig, and again, that's a really vigorous tree with a wide open structure, and its fruits are incredibly hard, and so I think they're able to resist pest pressure because of the density of the flesh. And they don't ripen until November. 20-30 years ago in New England, people would have a tough time ripening November apples like Granny Smith's. But now, this year we picked the limber twigs and they were ripe on the tree right at the end of October, beginning of November. So we see that growing window increasing. And then there's other, Grimes Golden is another great Southern apple that is, it's a parent of Golden Delicious purportedly, and is, this vigorous, healthy tree that blooms heavily, and its fruit is tough and makes great hard cider. And so, I guess I can't speak to what other Southern unique problems are that may be moving here. I mean, I guess there's a tarnished plant bug, and I'm sure there's other things on our way that are going to cause problems. But these guys have been through like much tougher conditions than we normally endure in New England. So that's my reasoning.
I think it's a valid reasoning. One thing I think about there with the selecting for southern varieties, and this is once again an assumption I'm making, but what would the impact be of late spring frosts on them if they've evolved in a place where they've never experienced a late spring frost and they are tuned to leaf out? I would assume they're tuned to leaf out earlier as well because of the southern climate and the longer growing season. So am I right in that assumption? Do you think that might be an issue as, the climate warms, but the frequency of late spring frost events like we had last year kind of remains high in New England?
True. So we're just that's a fine line to walk. But I mean, there's a lot of apples here that bloom fairly early. For instance, I mean, golden russet, traditionally grown in New England and New York, blooms on the early side, and that apple for us last year when we had the catastrophic frosts in May, the golden russet was the only one to come through it. All the English apples were much more badly affected by the frost, and they bloom later. So it's a little counterintuitive there. Sometimes it can just be luck or timing, depending on which developmental stage it's at. So that's hard to say. And then there's there were apples that were grown down south that were late blooming, like Rawls Janet, also grown up here in New England, extremely late blooming. But I think the problem with late blooming apples is that they are much more vulnerable to fire blight because a flower is essentially like an opening into the tree's vascular system. And when it's in full bloom and you have fire blight conditions, it's very vulnerable. So early blooming may be a good thing in that case in terms of avoiding fire blight. So, it's just always a trade-off.
Very interesting. I didn't know that regarding the sort of susceptibility to the bloom time. I am not someone who knows very much at all about cider making or about. I would call myself a cider amateur and early and enthusiast maybe, and a lot of that came from drinking your cider.
No, thanks.
Full disclosure, and I introduced my family visiting from Hawaii over the summer to your ciders. They had never had dry ciders before. They had only had stuff that you can buy in a grocery store, like Angry Orchard or something like that. So
Right.
they didn't really understand the complexity of what you can get in a bottle of hard cider, from semi-dry or really dry to some of the infusions that you do, which I think are really great. And I'd like to talk about those products, but could we talk about sort of the qualities in an apple that produce those complex ciders and the explanation, sort of maybe a little bit of the science behind it, if possible? Because a lot of people who have had apple cider before have just had sweet cider, and they might think that that is the end all be all, but it really isn't.
A good place to start would just be with, the like basic characteristics of apples. Like, you've got sugars, acids, and tannins as kind of like the big three. You've also got other flavor compounds that are important, but like to make a good hard cider, you need a balance of those elements. The thing about apples is they're not really analogous to like grape varieties where, say somebody, searches out a Cabernet Sauvignon or something like that, like single variety wines. Apples are something that are best like blended usually, because if you make you can make single variety ciders, if you have a suitable apple. Kingston Black from England is famous for making wonderful single variety cider. But, in my experience, a blended cider is something that you can balance out the elements that would make for sort of like a less enjoyable cider. And that's really like one of the most fun things about cider making is that you have your press blend that, when you're in the cider mill, you're pressing certain apples that you have on hand that are kind of, in the proper season of ripeness. And then you ferment them. And then, you may or may not have nailed the press blend, but then you can do post-fermentative blending. And so if the cider, doesn't have enough acid, you can blend a more acidic cider in, or if you want some more tannins, which give it the mouthfeel that, a lot of the European ciders are famous for, you can blend those in. Generally, like, the more interesting fruits, the better, but, a good balanced blend above all. And so even the qualities of acids can be different. I mean, apples mostly have malic acid in them, but they have a few other minor acids, and that can vary from variety to variety. And then the tannins are really interesting because there are long chain tannins that are smoother and more voluptuous, and there are short chain tannins which have a more bitter sensation. And the tannins are really an important component in traditional cider making because they're, in a time when people didn't add like sulfites to help preserve their ciders, tannins were effectively the antioxidants that functioned in the same way. That's the approach, and it's a lot of fun putting together cider blends. But I mean, the other thing I would say is that when you're comparing kind of like mass market ciders to orchard based ciders, mass market ciders really can't select for variety, or they don't really have control over that. They're at the mercy of the market and what they can get a hold of. But when you're orchard based, you do have control over that, and you can use these varieties that are known to make the best hard cider. And so that's why we've never kind of increased in scale. I've just always wanted to have that control over the final product. Our top apple right now is Golden Russet, which is really like a unique, flavorful apple. It has its own like fermentative quality. You can always tell a Golden Russet cider. It's sort of like a vanilla sugar cookie aroma that's part of the taste of the hard cider. But there's so many good ones out there. It's just it's really great to go around and taste what different orchards are doing. See how people are interpreting those and fermenting them.
So the blends that you do where ginger is added or elderberry or blackberry, how exactly is that done?
My preference is for fermenting if I'm going to do a flavored cider, like just add blackcurrant or ginger or something like that. It's always post-fermentatively. If you ferment those fruits or spices into the cider from the get-go, you don't always end up with something that's necessarily what you think. Like the fruit flavors may change during fermentation. So we usually have a base cider, which is a kind of a milder cider that doesn't have super strong flavor characteristics of its own. And so then when we add, we'll make our own organic ginger syrups, or we grow a lot of small fruit on the orchard, like blackcurrants or raspberries or blackberries. And so we'll make simple syrups with those fruits, and we'll just add them afterwards to the hard cider. And that's our technique. I mean, there's obviously different ways to go about it, but that's how I feel like you get the kind of the purest fruit flavor from the additions.
No, it's really astounding. I mean, the ginger one, especially the way that the ginger sort of like permeates that vessel of the 750 bottle,
Right.
you could have fooled me. You could have told me that it was in the whole from beginning to end throughout the entire process, and I would have believed you. I've seen some combinations with aronia, which is a shrub that interests me. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I was in the Finger Lakes region, and I think it was maybe black duck cidery, but they incorporated aronia, and I thought that the sort of last taste on the tongue was just really interesting. Do you have any interest in incorporating aronia or other, shrubs or tree crops that you haven't had the chance to yet in the future?
Totally. And yeah, funny that you mentioned aronia because I mean, like what an amazing plant. It's just so hardy. And some of those selections like Nero or Viking are big fruit and easy to harvest. I was doing some reading about aronia, and it turns out I can't actually cite the source, but I was reading that it's a Russian tradition to make a cider with aronia berries. I asked my friend John O'Niger, who has Big River chestnuts up the road. He's growing some aronia there. If I could get some aronia berries from him to do a co-ferment. So we did a little like a bench trial, just a 5-gallon carboy of this aronia cider that we actually fermented on the aronia fruit, like a red wine would be fermented. So because I wanted to see if I could like maximize extraction from the skins that way. It just finished up fermenting. I just tried it, and it's really interesting. It's, I mean, maybe a little black curranty or something like that, but sort of like with a vinous quality too. There's definitely like a red wine. I'm reminded of that. So anyway, it's one I want to keep experimenting with. The color is phenomenal. I mean, it's just like this beautiful clear purple red. Yeah, there's a lot of exciting different variations you can do with fruit and cider. So hopefully we'll find out more about that in the future and start producing it in a larger scale.
That's kind of the case, not just for aronia, but for a lot of these tree crops or woody shrubs that folks like us are interested in. Like the product, I mean, aronia, eat it isn't really something you eat out of hand, and even like if you wanted to make an aronia pie, you'd probably be adding a lot of sugar or mixing it with blueberries or something. But the qualities that it has works perfectly for the idea of a cider. And I bet you that there, I mean, I don't, I just I'm interested in what some of the other analogs of that could be in a regenerative orchard context, like I'm just throwing some ideas out there. Gummy berries or some of these more unusual tree crops, sea berry, what are some of the other
Yeah,
potentials?
we love gumi. I have a giant gumi bush on at our homestead, but unfortunately, the pigment is lycopene, so that's like a not a waterborne color compound. It's like oil soluble, to my understanding. So I haven't tried to ferment it because I've noticed when I process it, it does kind of separate out and it works. I've made a really good barbecue sauce with gumi, which, it's kind of similar to a tomato, I guess, in that way. But one thing that we've been playing around with is we have a big old native persimmon. And so we've tried a lot of persimmon cider co-ferments. And the strange thing about them is it's actually pretty difficult to get them not to turn into vinegar. Something about, I don't know, whatever is on the persimmon fruit itself. Maybe there's a lot of acetobacter or something like that. But on the other hand, the plus side is that the vinegar is phenomenal. I mean, persimmon vinegar is just so full bodied. So, we've tried like 50-50 like apple cider persimmon fruit mash that then has to be, squeezed out and you get this cloudy persimmon vinegar that is really wonderful. And so I would say that has a lot of potential as a specialty vinegar. And I know certainly in Korea and Japan, they really value persimmon vinegar as being one of the like most flavorful vinegars. You could find it there, and it's like revered. It's very expensive. So I feel like that's a niche that we could definitely do a lot of research in.
So other products that you have besides cider, like the shrub and the different syrups and vinegars. Personally, I haven't tried them because I just migrate straight for the cider that you make. But could we just? But I see folks posting them all over Instagram and just ranting and raving about how fantastic they are. What are their uses? Like, if you're purchasing some of those products, how are you using them in the kitchen, or what are their intended uses generally?
Well, we produce two vinegars. One's sort of a straight up fruity one, and another one is a what we call our special reserve, which is an aged style, like a 3 to 5 year old sherry vinegar type. But I think what you're talking about is our shrubs. So that's our shrubs are like a vinegar based fruit drink. Some people call them like drinking vinegars, and it's an old fashioned tradition, again, colonial era, that you take a fruit, a vinegar, and a sweetener, and you let the fruit macerate in the vinegar, and then you strain it out. And what you have is this: the vinegar like preserves the fruit essence without fermentation, and the sweetness helps keep it as well. But it also, like, the way we love to use it is just basically to put a splash in water or sparkling water, let's say, and you dilute it. It just makes like a refreshing beverage. Like Switchel's another one of those. It's like another colonial era. It's basically vinegar, ginger, and some kind of a sweetener. We use cider syrup, but there's no set recipe. Traditionally, it's been anything including maple syrup or molasses, or depending where you are. But they're all like kind of used as thirst quenching beverages. So it's just a great example of like old technology where it doesn't even need to be canned or like heat treated or anything like that. The vinegar just helps preserve the fruity qualities without any need for like high energy inputs.
That's really interesting. I guess going off of that idea of, low energy inputs and farming regeneratively, and also just commenting on the sort of recent boom of cider culture in New England in the past, I don't know, 20 years. How do you see this all fitting into, our climate change future here? And do you think that because I mean, there's a lot of people out there who are really into wild apples and cider making, and it's like we're in the middle of a cider renaissance, maybe. Do you think that this fits into a new sort of climate smart agriculture future where we're hedging our bets against the things to come?
Well, I hope so. I mean, certainly like the people who are really into wild apple foraging, like the work Matt Kaminsky's doing is, essentially like crowdsourcing genetics from like these survivor trees that are growing out in the wild, and they're really like well adapted to local conditions, and they're tough, and they're, whatever it is that allowed them to grow and thrive. Probably they have valuable traits that may be translatable to orchard plantings. And so, a lot of it's unknown, but once you take a tree out of the environment that it grew in and put it in an orchard context, it's a little different. But on the other hand, a lot of these wild apples are not really culinary fruit. They're really suited for cider making because they have, outrageous amounts of tannins or acids or, flavor intensity that, apples for eating don't have. And so, yeah, I think that interest is definitely going to, and people collecting wild apples and foraging them is definitely going to pay off for us, because we're going to, have all of these really interesting new varieties to evaluate and to make cider with.
And so if somebody is listening to this and they have a family farm that is a conventional orchard, and they're interested, maybe they're like the young farmer or the 20 something who is going to inherit a part of the farm and maybe wants to do something different, what would they do to start and to sort of shift the narrative or shift the paradigm away from conventional to a more regenerative practice?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's a risky proposition, because like when you depart from what is conventionally successful, and these conventional systems work really well, they produce fruit. But so when we're going down this different road here to say, how can we do these things with less chemical inputs and less energy intensively? It's really still in development. We're still figuring this out, like, alternative orchard systems, let's call them. And so it could range from somebody just deciding to plant a whole bunch of different new varieties for evaluation in their orchard just to see how they do, can approach it that way. Or you could take a more of a risk and just, I don't know, do something completely different and get into sort of the agroforestry silvopasture type systems. So I don't know. It's tough because trees obviously require like a tremendous investment of time and money, and there's no payoff for a long time, and so it's hard to leap into the unknown when so much is at stake in that way. We've taken some gambles here at our orchard, and some have done well, and other ones really have failed. And so, if I was really conservative, I'd say to myself, "Boy, I just took a bath on that. I lost tens of thousands of dollars on this failed planting." But I don't know. It's something. If you really believe in it, you'll be willing to take those risks. It's hard to, you know, say what people should do or shouldn't do, but that's certainly what I believe in, that we need to take some of these risks.
And I'm in agreement with you there. From the CV that you sent me in preparation for the episode, something that really popped out to me was this Lotta Crabtree Fellowship. I know that there's going to be some people who listen to this who will be UMass Amherst graduates. For those who are listening who are not, maybe you'll consider going to UMass just to be able to have access to this interesting fund. Could we talk about that a little bit and what you use the fund for?
Sure, it's a little bit mysterious, but I mean the origin story is pretty incredible, right? It's like this child entertainer from the gold rush era who became wealthy because this was out west, because like prospectors were literally throwing like gold nuggets on the stage after she performed, somehow amassed like incredible wealth that way, but then had a connection to agriculture maybe in her old age, and wanted to support agricultural students at UMass by endowing a trust that would provide a fund, a stipend for certain students there. So, do I have that right? I mean, this is like 20 years ago, but
Basically, from what I read, yeah, she amassed her wealth from gold nuggets, and then anybody who graduates from UMass, no matter what you study, you don't have to study agriculture, can just apply for this 0% loan for 10 years. And it doesn't even say what, like, if there's like a cap for the amount of money that you could borrow. So I was like, what? Like, I could start a farm with 0% interest. Yeah, I don't know.
yeah,
What was your experience getting this grant?
it was a grant, and it was a stipend. It was like a graduate stipend. So basically, along with a teaching fellowship, it just allowed me to afford grad school and not escape in terrible debt. So I'm really grateful for that. But it's pretty mysterious that the fellowship is administered by some, I don't know, trustees in Boston, and I don't know if they're easy to get a hold of, or but certainly, yeah, really intriguing in terms of that kind of open invitation to applying for a zero interest loan. That's all I know.
Well, I guess for anyone who's listening who's a UMass grad, look into it. It's called the Lotta Crabtree Fellowship or Lotta Crabtree Fund, and it can support your farming endeavors with 0% interest for up to 10 years. Seems like really cool resource out there for anyone who is a graduate. You didn't have to study in the Stockbridge School, or at least it doesn't say that. So I know that you wanted to talk about a little bit more in depth some of the agroforestry orchard systems that you've got going on at Carr's Ciderhouse and Preservation Orchard. Do you think now would be a good time to do that?
I just wanted to just touch briefly on some of those like other alternative orchard systems that you were kind of alluding to, or like how can people approach orcharding differently? I've come up with like two potential approaches, which are sort of like a mixed species orchard system, where you'd have like varied tree crop species, interplanted together in like an alley cropping system with an emphasis on kind of like a wide variety of genetics. So it would be effectively like kind of hedging your bets due to climate uncertainty with a wide variety of crops. And so that could include, obviously apples or pears or, other traditional tree fruit, but, also kind of, nuts or honey locusts or something like that if you were planning on integrating animals with your system. So that's one of the big ones that we're working on right now, is like, how do we mimic like a hybrid between, say, like a natural forest ecosystem and then a traditional orchard. One of the things that like is really important in traditional orchards is you actually do want to have like pretty firm control over like what are your cultivars, when do you harvest them, do they come in sequence, is this a like you can process them in a timely fashion, you're not like overwhelmed, and so forth. So traditional orchard blocks are also really important for maintaining that kind of like orderly production. To that end, I've also been trying to develop like a semi-dwarf high-headed orchard system, which is it's like a hybrid between an old-fashioned orchard where the high heading is where the branching structure of the tree starts, 5, 6 feet above the ground, not lower. So it allows you to mow and graze quite close to the trees. Doing this with semi-dwarf trees instead of standard fruit trees planted more closely together. So it's just kind of like a giant row of like lollipop trees. If you can imagine, maybe, they wouldn't really grow much more than 12 or 16 feet high at the most, but the branching would start a lot higher. And so you'd get some of the benefits of dwarf systems, but with the ability to graze or mow underneath. And so those are different approaches that we're exploring right now just to see how we can like integrate all these goals together to produce fruit.
And I understand that you have some young heart nuts in your system. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, they haven't started bearing yet, but in 2018, after we got hammered by fire blight, I started planting other trees. I was like, all right, I clearly need to diversify here. So we put in 2 acres of hybrid Chinese chestnuts, and we put in a 2 acre block of heart nuts, which are mostly cultivar heart nuts from Grimo, and including like Imshu, and yeah, they're just starting to bear. They're like phenomenal growers. Some of these trees are 4 or 5 years old and are already 16, 20 feet tall. So again, these are just ways we can hedge against adverse weather events and sell a variety of products at our farm stand. Also to serve at our cider bar. So, roasted nuts are just great. Yeah. Enjoy yourself with a glass of hard cider.
In regards to the heart nuts and the chestnuts, I mean, lots of folks who listen to this podcast are familiar with those tree crops, but have you had much in the way of people not understanding or having a relationship with some of the products that are a little bit more specialty and having issues with sort of the marketability of them at all? Or do people just know and they're just like, yeah, roasted chestnuts, love it?
It's funny, like everybody knows roasted chestnuts, but like a lot of people haven't actually tried them. But then people want to taste them, and we've been offering them for sale, raw at our farm stand and also roasted at our cider garden bar. But yeah, people are psyched. And then you also have the communities of people who grew up in other cultures, like whatever in China or in Europe, or who basically were used to having chestnuts, and then when they find out that they can get them locally, they're really excited about that. So there's definitely a huge untapped market for chestnuts that we're going to see filled. There's a lot of chestnuts getting planted around now, which is wonderful. So, and I mean, as far as heart nuts go, not that I've tried to sell them yet, but I guess I would just explain them as just being, walnuts essentially. So, a walnut with a different shape.
I think that's a good. I found that the flavor I've tried a few different heart nuts now. The flavor to me was a little bit different than what I was used to with a walnut, but it wasn't that different, it was just a little bit different. So what about with selling pawpaws or you have mulberry trees? Are there other specialty fruits that have been received well, or people are like, what's this? How do I eat it?
Mulberries are tough because they're so delicate. Same with pawpaws, but I mean, mulberries are really tough to harvest without getting all juicy and squishy. Although they're phenomenal fresh. So I mean, we have a giant Illinois everbearing that, like, we're trying to figure out, how can we grow more of these trees and make them something that we can sell. But I don't know. I mean, one cultivar I'm interested in is one called Kokuso, which is supposedly a little firmer, and so it might make it easier to pick them and put them in little berry containers for people without them getting all squished. And then yeah, the pawpaws are great. There's a ton of interest in pawpaws. I mean, we just have a little pawpaw grove. We had a Pennsylvania golden that I've let sucker everywhere. So again, the management of them is you have to really be on it. Otherwise, they get bruised really easily and they don't keep and so forth. But so much potential for all these delicious fruits. So it's just we're excited about everything.
And do you think that either pawpaws or mulberries, do you think that either of those will make it into a cider, or is that unprecedented?
I'm a little leery of pawpaws. Well, actually, we did try a cider once that had some like a fresh pawpaw pulp added to it, and it made the cider really like it gave it like a tropical quality, which was pretty cool. So we might do that again. I definitely wouldn't ferment them though. So that again, this would be like a post fermentation addition of like sweetened pulp. And then the mulberries, I have found that what makes them so delicious as a fresh fruit doesn't necessarily translate well to a cider. It's more They kind of taste like a blackberry when you use them, but they don't have like, they're not quite as distinctive as a blackberry. So I regard the blackberry as like a superior fruit for like a cider edition.
Gotcha. As I said the pawpaw thing, I was like, wait a minute, all of the issues with cetogenins and I don't know, there's lots of things that you're allegedly not supposed to do with pawpaw. So I imagine that fermenting it into a cider would probably not be a good idea. But
Right.
people make pawpaw beer, like I've had pawpaw beer before, and
Uh-huh.
I can't say that it tasted very much like pawpaw, but someone did it, and I don't know, I drank it. I'm still here. I'm fine. So I don't know. Um,
Yeah.
I guess just wrapping up, if folks are interested in visiting the farm stand or purchasing some cider or some other products like the shrub, yeah, where can they find you and where can they keep up with your work? Or if they want to visit in person and see the orchard, is that something that they could do?
Well, we're hoping maybe to have a couple, open orchard field days, which we will announce on social media. But at Carr Ciderhouse on Instagram is a good way to keep up. And sometimes Nicole posts to Facebook as well. But I would say the best thing to do is come by our farm stand in North Hadley or visit our cider garden from May to November on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then you can try all our hard ciders on tap and you can try shrubs and anything you're curious about if you want to just get a glass of it or even whatever. We'll pour sample spoons and stuff like that if you're curious. And it's kind of this outdoor picnic seating under these 10-year-old chestnut trees. We're hoping to add cheese plates and maybe even grilled lamb sausages from the orchard to the menu this year. So stay tuned. I hope that all comes together.
Fantastic.
Okay, thanks, Mike, so much. And as just the last thing I wanted to say is, thanks so much for making this podcast. I think that we live in some dark times in certain respects, and you guys are like such a bright spot, like highlighting all this wonderful, exciting plant-based work that really has made me happy to listen to. So thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us, and listeners, thank you for sticking around till the end of the episode. We'll see you next time.